Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be bringing back the live interview series that we did. The last episode was about 12 months ago. It all kicked off with the very first lockdown that we all experienced across New Zealand during that COVID-19 pandemic and response. It led me to reaching out to subject matter experts whilst we were all stuck at home, not really knowing what was going on, to ask them, what was some of the best practices for us to observe? What were some of their experiences and some of their ways in which to tackle the COVID-19 response? And then as the months went on, it turned into a much more broader, wider thing where we were doing quite regular catch-ups with some really amazing subject matter experts. None least is the person that we are about to hear from in a moment. DeAnne has been an amazing source of information and guidance, not only during these conversations, but also within the NZHSP Facebook community in general. So it's with great pleasure that I will bring to the screen DeAnne. How are you?
Good, thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's a beautiful day here in Wellington, so.
Good. Pleased to hear it. Yeah. Same here with some blue skies and sunshine in Christchurch. I was actually in Wellington yesterday very briefly. I think I may have brought the southern weather with me. It was pretty miserable yesterday morning. Glad to be seeing the blue skies. So look, for those who perhaps are tuning in for the first time or may not necessarily have had an opportunity to see any of our previous recordings, perhaps you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourself and let us know who you are.
Oh, sure. So I'm DeAnne Brabant. I'm a barrister and mediator. My background is that I was for 5.5 years one of the first prosecutors at WorkSafe. So I was there from pretty much the start of WorkSafe, and prosecuted a number of cases, including corrections and the Port of Lyttelton and the Athenbury first Haswa case. So that's my background. I'm also the author of Westlaw, along with Mike Cosman and another person, the author of the health and safety package on Westlaw and protecting employees package. So that's kind of my sideline thing that I try and do in the meantime in between doing work. And my work at the moment includes health and safety, employment and resource management act cases.
Yeah. All right.
And some civil cases as well. Yep.
Lots of experience, and clearly you're helping to set the scene in a way in a much broader health and safety context here in New Zealand. So it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you once again. The aim really is for us to be able to do this on a regular basis so that we can catch up on some of the most recent case law findings, prosecutions, outcomes, so that we're all kept up to speed with the latest interpretations of the Health and Safety at Work Act, but also the other pieces of legislation and regulations that have an influence on the broader health and safety scope and what we all deal with. So with that said, I mean, obviously it's been, best part of a year since we've caught up. I think the last time we were speaking, there was, for obvious reasons, lots of conversation taking place around Whakaari, White Island event, what had happened, and also the early stages of the court hearings, who was being charged, and what that may mean. So at that point in time, we were still trying to gauge what this was going to look like and what were some of the likely outcomes. And then since then, we've had one prosecution, which I was hoping we might be able to delve into, so perhaps we could extract some learnings from that. So in terms of that, obviously we've had in-flight charters have been prosecuted, which took place in March of this year, and they were fined the best part of $250,000 for some key findings. So perhaps would you like to elaborate on what some of those key findings by the judge was, and perhaps key learnings from that?
Well, just as by way of background, as you're aware, WorkSafe, the Whakaari investigation was the largest ever investigation that WorkSafe had done. And it was pretty encompassing. And when we first talked, Matt, we were just not sure, and we couldn't be sure because we didn't know what the summary of facts said or what was what the charges were, the nature of the charges were, exactly what each entity was accused of, but also what their role was in respect of the incident. Well, it turns out that the prosecution of In-Flight Charters Limited actually wasn't about them in terms of interacting with the island at the time of the incident. But what they've done is that they'd organised a tour earlier in the day to the island, and their charges actually relate to their charges don't relate to any of their customers actually being harmed on the island at the time, so it's a no harm prosecution. But what the prosecution was about was, and I think, Matt, we talked about this because I could see that, and we talked about the changes on the island and all of those sort of things in the previous talks that we'd had. This was about dynamic risk assessment on the day and actually pre-planning and seeing and checking the state of the island, what the reports, GNS reports were, and making a call not to take people to the island. So, of course, WorkSafe is very clear that the entity In-Flight, that they could, they could have actually had harm to their people that they'd sent in early in the morning. It was just fortuitous that the island actually erupted later in the day, not when their people were there. So they were absolutely captured. And I guess by analogy, this is like if you were a tour operator and you were organising tours to go climbing up Mount Ruapehu, and there was a potential risk of avalanches or an eruption there, then the expectation would be that you would do that sort of recce first, and you would assess whether or not it was appropriate to be sending people there, and you'd call off the tour on that day if it wasn't.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, it causes me to reflect on my previous life. So I've had lots of experiences in lots of various industries, one of which was in the ski field sector. So for a while there, I was a snowboard instructor in my previous life. And every day without fail, the ski field operator would have one or two professional seasoned experts do a recce of the ski field, assess and identify the risk for avalanche, and act on it long before any of the patrons were exposed to the ski field. So, I mean, it would be a fair assumption that surely something like that would have been in place for something as high risk as visiting an active volcano. So it just strikes me.
And I think it sort of extends beyond that too, right? Like, so if you'd done that recce, but you were arriving at the island and you saw that the conditions look different than what you normally would expect, the same thing would apply, that the dynamic risk assessment, this doesn't look right, if in doubt, pull out. So it really is sort of it's really good because it's actually a case that's really about risk management.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
making the appropriate decision. And the charge was under Section 36(2) because they had an obligation to other persons. So they don't have they're organising the tours and they're responsible for the people that are attending the tours, but they're doing that through the ship operator, etc. So that the obligations to other persons. I think so. In terms of the sentence, which is it was 227,500, and there were prosecution costs of 40,000, and of course initially they pled not guilty. So I'm looking at this and I haven't seen the sentencing notes, so that's my caveat. But it still was, I think it was still considered to be a reasonable culpability there to end up with a fine of 22,500 after reductions. And so that's a bit of a wake-up call for people, like in terms of making decisions. And it's not it's got wider applicability. It's not just about in this industry with volcanoes, etc. It's about also everyone considering changes in the environment or things that are happening and then making a change about risk assessment. So if you're a lines company and it was actually going to be a full-on storm, you're not going to send people up power poles without the right measures in place. Or
yeah, absolutely.
It's not too different, right? It's not particular to Whakaari.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so with the fact that the company, despite the fact that they pled not guilty initially, but then changed to guilty, leading to a prompt prosecution, can we glean anything from that? Can we make any, I appreciate it's still before the courts, but can we make any assumption around what that may mean for those who could possibly be found guilty who have pled not guilty in terms of the fine?
In terms of the Sentencing Act,
yes.
If you plead guilty at the earliest possible stage, you get a reduction of 25% from the starting point of the sentence.
Right. Okay.
You get other reductions too, like showing remorse and other things like that. And yes. And you also get recognition of measures that you've taken in order to resolve and ensure that you don't offend again.
Yep.
They can't really say that you are not showing remorse if you plead not guilty, because that's your right, particularly if you believe that the charges are not appropriate.
Yes.
What happens in between entering a plea is that WorkSafe and the PCBU's counsel will work through the summary of facts and come to an agreement on what the facts of the case are, and that's the basis for sentencing too. So before entering the guilty plea, they would have actually negotiated that summary of facts and the basis for.
Okay.
So there's a number of things that kind of go on before you actually plead. In terms of the others, they most likely have lost their 25% reduction if they were to be found guilty at trial.
Yep.
It's very difficult to argue when you go through a full trial that you're entitled to that, and that 25% reduction really is about saving time in the courts, money, and not putting victims through further distress.
Of course. And probably a bit of a silly question, but it will be safe to assume that the court fees, if found guilty, will be significantly more than if you.
Or the prosecution costs will be more. So, some of the prosecution costs in cases can be upwards of $150,000. In these cases, maybe a lot more because of experts and all that. So expert reports, etc. Their appearance at court, the cost associated with that could be actually quite high.
Yep. So in terms
of, I believe that too, that the charges, because some of them probably are novel, that the charges are defensible because they're continuing on with their defence. Unlike Nima, for example, who applied to have the charges dismissed, and they were.
Yeah, which is really an interesting one, and I'm keen to pick up on that briefly in a moment. So before I go on, those who are tuning in live, I can see you out there. Please feel free to ask any questions or any comments that you may wish DeAnne or myself to attempt to answer whilst we're on this call. So that option is there and is available to you. So please feel free to put in your questions. So I just recall when we first started talking about this, when it first hit the headlines and we were getting our heads around the fact that this was going to be going through the courts, the timeframes were, for me as a layman, felt like they were pretty phenomenal in terms of when we were likely to actually see this come to its natural conclusion. And you were suggesting from memory that it would be at least a solid couple of years before we really get to the final parts of the play, right? So,
and that was before COVID. So,
yes.
so now it's probably longer. One of the issues that they have raised in one of the last calls is the venue and where they'd actually hold the trial. The charges are laid in Whakaari, Whakatane, because Whakatane, because it's the closest to where the incident happened, and most of the entities that are charged are situated there. So that's a very small courtroom. I've been in there, and it's not a very big court. Yes. So they're now having to find a venue, which often happens in my RMA environment court cases, that I've had hearings held in town halls because of the public interest and the number of people that are likely to be there.
Yeah.
And I'd say this will have significant public interest, as well as the fact that for each of the entities, there will be multiple people that would be there present in the court. And there's going to be media. It's going to be probably televised. Well, it will be. And it'll be likely to be internationally televised as well, given the overseas connections with the shipping.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, obviously,
so providing a logistics issue for everybody, which is also providing additional delays.
But from a purely selfish point of view, what an amazing opportunity to see this actually in practice. And I'm sure many of us will glean a lot of learnings from it as well. So safe to say it's still a long time. And before we'll be
it will be, and I think it will be, I don't know how long they estimated for the trial, but it's got to be in excess of 5 weeks, I would think, with the number of parties involved. And they'll all be heard together, so it's going to go on for a while. One of the longest ones regulatory ones that I'd heard of was Hawke's Bay fishing, which was 7 months for the trial every day in court.
Every day. Goodness me. That would be exhausting for everyone.
Yeah.
Gosh. Okay. How interesting. Okay. So my final question around the Whakaari cases is, I guess, from a layman point of view, I see this as a prime opportunity for business leaders, officers, PCBUs to finally recognize the full implications of not adhering to the Act. And I see this as potentially being the instance where we actually see the floodgates open, where businesses are beginning to ask the right types of questions of their senior leaders and executive teams, are likely to start asking questions.
But the other way down too, because in my experience and the work that I do with boards and dealing with them is actually getting them to recognise risk and ask the right questions. And when near misses and incidents happen, really drilling down into those and finding out what the root cause was.
Yes.
And then making sure that the right people assess whether or not their measures that they have in place, the mitigating measures, are actually fit for purpose and appropriate. And the other thing is that, board members, they need to be considering all sorts of things like purchasing and those sort of things in the light of health and safety as well, and having a particular health and safety budget set aside, and making sure, when you buy equipment like a forklift or whatever, that you actually get the one that's not as noisy as other ones, and those sort of things to protect hearing, etc., that you have an opportunity at that point when you're commissioning planting to pick the right one.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm hoping that there will be some procurement managers listening to this, and their ears hopefully will be pricking up as you say that, because I recall having many interesting conversations and debates with procurement managers who didn't seem to understand the implications of not taking health and safety into consideration when purchasing new pieces of equipment.
WorkSafe's due diligence guide, Section 44, is really, really good about that, and it's got all of the various questions, including about purchasing of plant, etc. Yeah, and I think that's the thing, that you just need to set the right policies in place in the workplace, and then you need to actually monitor and police them and make sure that they're complied with.
Absolutely. That is brilliant. So I also noted, going off tangent a little bit, but the recent best practice guidelines that have come out from WorkSafe, safe work on roadsides and within roads, there's some great content in there around upstream and downstream responsibilities, and how to, the types of hazards of risk associated with that and how to manage that. I'm doing a bit of a breakdown of that particular document because I'm really impressed by it. I think there's some excellent information in there, well beyond simply the roadside health and safety considerations. So if anyone hasn't had a chance to get a copy of that, I strongly recommend jumping on it and having a read through. Excellent. Basically from my perspective, I think you're absolutely right. And also is the likelihood that employees, that workers will also be asking better quality questions of their business owners, directors and senior leaders as well. So I think,
and health and safety reps, and if things aren't right, then issuing provisional improvement notices and those sort of things if they meet the criteria. Workers refusing to do work if they follow the right steps, about notifying the employer and saying it's unsafe, the practices, and doing the right steps. You don't just throw down your tools and walk off, but if you work through the right steps and you involve a health and safety rep, etc., and that's quite powerful too, particularly if you've come to the end of your tether, that things aren't actually getting dealt with, and you determine it's not safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I guess Port of Littleton case, the second Port of Littleton case, where the worker refused to go up a cherry picker that had excessive slue in the boom.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's what's been on my mind is there's been events just like that, and it just doesn't seem to be resonating en masse. And I hope that Whakaari may prove to be the watershed moment where we really start to see it taken seriously.
My thoughts on that, though, are that people think having the paperwork and the systems are enough, and it's not. There's a whole lot more beyond that. And even within the paperwork is having the right policies, procedures, etc., JSAs and that, and having them be practicable and able to be achieved rather than sort of aspirational is really important. But also, like things like at toolbox meetings, having picking one of your policy documents and asking the workers questions about it and keeping them up to speed and up to date with what those are. And when you have changes in the workplace, then reassessing all of those.
Safety Unplugged is brought to you by Advanced Safety, keeping health and safety simple since 2016. We partner with our clients to ensure they know exactly where they stand with health and safety compliance and have access to groundbreaking solutions and the health and safety professionals to bring your goals to life in half the time. Our promise: we will listen to your needs, provide clarity, and always deliver on time. Reach out today to begin your health and safety journey.
Now, you you mentioned to me recently around the Greater Wellington Regional Council versus SL Adams, which from first glance it's like, well, what's that got to do with health and safety? But actually, there's some really interesting insights into this and how important it is for regulators to get their evidence and have their case really well produced before it even gets into the courts. So with me rattling on, perhaps if you could just let us know a little bit more about that particular case. So the GWRC.
I was one of the counsel on that case. John Martin and I represented the landowners. So in that case, the Greater Wellington Regional Council had decided that some land in Whitemans Valley was a wetland, a natural wetland. And under the RMA, wetland are protected, and there's various rules about what you can and can't do in wetland, and you've got an obligation to protect them and to keep them as a functioning ecosystem. So Mr. Adams purchased the land off someone else, and it was already prepared for subdivision and had been consented for subdivision, and then he went on to try to get the consents from the Upper Hutt City Council in relation to the actual subdivision and the works that were going to be done there. And part of that was getting an ecological assessment to work out what areas were wetland or not.
Yes.
And there was one done earlier in that year of 2019 where it said that quite a few areas were wetland. But that was also before that. So there's an exemption to wetland, which is that there's a pastoral exemption if it's wetted pasture, or so land that's traditionally been a farm that's been drained might still meet some characteristics of a wetland, but it's exempt under the Act because it's actually got improved pasture or rushes. So you while it might be wetland, you deem that it's not because of those factors.
Sure.
GWRC hadn't produced their pastoral plants list, and at the time the ecologist did that assessment without that list and without the ability to actually deem. So later on she does another one in the November, and it turns out that less of the land is now wetland because she's applied that pastoral list. The responsibility for creating the pastoral list was actually with GWRC.
Interesting. Okay,
so they hadn't done it. GWRC decides that because it's now no longer wetland, some parts of it, that Mr. Adams destroyed the wetland by the works that he'd undertaken. And they prosecuted him. And they also sought enforcement orders against Upper Hutt City Council for actually having granted the consents for the sites, and against my clients who had actually purchased the land. So they bought this land, and then some of them were told that they couldn't build on any of their land, so none of it.
Yeah. Wow.
GWRC were mounted a significant case in the Environment Court. I think it was thousands and thousands of documents, and they produced evidence from their internal scientists and their enforcement officer, etc., about why the court should say that this was wetland and why they should issue the enforcement notices and make my clients also restore it back to being wetland. The upshot of it is that it turns out, and it was something that we maintained, John and I, from the outset, that it never was wetland. It hadn't been since 1840.
Wow.
The use of the land had been, it had been drained and it had been farmed and had been ripped and mowed, and that in accordance with farming practices, and that this land was actually designated as rural residential, so for lifestyle. And the court agreed. The court agreed with Mr. Adams' counsel, us, and Upper Hutt City Council's council that it wasn't wetland, that it didn't have the hydrology, it didn't have all the factors that actually make it to be a wetland. And even if it was a wetland, that those exemptions applied.
Yeah.
So the upshot of this is the court was very unhappy with Greater Wellington Regional Council.
Yeah.
And the lesson in this is that there was the council officers were very, very sure of themselves about their position that they took. And that flowed into their experts, etc., also believing that position and looking for evidence that supported that position. When you had the other experts on the other side, and when you went through all the steps of what actually made up, and there was an absence of information. They just hadn't actually done hydrology assessments. They hadn't assessed the soils, and they hadn't looked at the nature of the flows and whether or not this actually was a wetland, and also the vegetation there and the pastoral exemption. The court, in the end, and this is rare, awarded indemnity costs, so the full costs of the lawyers taking the cases for each of the parties that they sought to enforce against.
Wow.
So we're looking at about $800,000,
Oh my goodness.
including experts. And then the court went further, because in the Environment Court, they can actually also order costs to themselves. And they did. They ordered $100,000.
Wow.
To the court. The court's actual cost was something like $150,000, but they ordered $100,000 because it went through a 2-week trial, and it had put people to a lot of stress, and it was there was no evidential sufficiency. Yeah.
So basically, there was no case to answer.
No case to answer. In terms of an enforcement notice, if you think about it in the Haswa sense, it's the same as an improvement notice or maybe a prohibition notice. So it's the equivalent of issuing one of those without the evidence to support them, or having in terms of a reasonable belief.
That's obviously huge, and that's potentially a bit of a watershed moment in itself. And I assume that should be a serious warning to all regulators and government bodies that they need to be confident that there is a case to answer before even writing.
Well, and test their own experts, like test their bias, test what their reasons are, test. I think when I was at WorkSafe, we used to be quite careful about having WorkSafe's own people as the experts.
Sure.
And so, my view would be if you're somebody that's defending something like that, then you definitely need independent experts.
So then that kind of makes me question or wonder about the recent case that was thrown out. That was a WorkSafe Whakaari, yes. So there's 2 operators. They were accused of having completely insufficient workplace health and safety management systems in place. But it was thrown out because, again, there was no case to answer. And it sounds, some of the details that came out from that, potentially the 2 WorkSafe inspectors perhaps were only on location for 30 minutes at best.
I think it's 15 actually, Matt, so it's even worse.
So I was just doing them a favour by saying that.
Yeah, you were, because Judge Mays was very scathing about it.
Yeah.
And what she referred to it as being negligent. Yeah, and the paper referred to it as a flying visit, which is
yes.
And in terms of an assessment of a mine, 15 minutes does seem very short period of time to consider plant and everything else that was there. So this is the Mount Summer Sands Quarry. And and it concluded that the excavator operator was in danger of being engulfed at the bank he was digging out at the time.
Yeah.
So it was rejected, and they were ordered to pay costs too. So the costs were 160,000. So nowhere near GWRC and Adams, but if it had gone through a trial and that had happened, they might have as well. Costs in criminal cases you don't get to cover, generally don't get your full costs back. So I think their costs would have been a lot more than that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And the judge said the charge ought to not have been laid. And to be fair to and that WorkSafe's attempt to fundamentally alter the charge when it released the prosecution had little chance. So it was an abusive process. So what they'd done is that they had laid the charge and then they'd sought to amend the charge once they laid it, probably, in a way potentially to try and rectify the position in respect to the charges. But there is a thing in terms of charges where you actually should have certainty about what it's alleged that you have done at the time of charging.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as the paper reports, and this is not my comment about WorkSafe, but WorkSafe was unrepentant, and they said that they disagreed with the comments made by the judge about the conduct of the prosecution, and they were disappointed in Crown Law for refusing to consent to the appeal against the decision. Now, I find that a bit interesting because with Athenbury, WorkSafe considered that that case also was wrongly decided in some aspects, and they weren't granted the right to appeal by Crown Law because they have to approve it, but they never went out saying anything of the sort in relation to that case. So that's just an observation about that.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's arising out of an unannounced visit. It was 15 minutes. An expert for the defence said after assessing the slope and the ways that the hazard were handled, concluded the risks of engulfment were overstated and highly unlikely. So it's like a knee-jerk reaction to what they actually saw at the site without actually having anything informed, which is very similar to the GWRC and Adams in terms of making that determination, which permeated through everything, that it was a wetland.
Yeah. Yep.
And then every decision making after that rolled.
It's been driven by it. It's it's the beauty of hindsight, right? But I mean, it feels like in almost both instances, it just needed to have a conversation to actually, just sit down and go, what is it we're actually doing here, and to do the due diligence before going down this road.
Do the risk gap analysis, do the assessment, do the what evidence do we have? What are the with the wetland? What are the criteria that make it a wetland? Do we actually have that criteria?
Yeah.
It's the same when you're doing an audit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You have to be careful. And if you're doing an audit, because some of them that I'm seeing these days, and you would be doing these too, Matt, and I can't say too much about cases that I'm actually dealing with, but I can't say anything. But there are lots of contracts being terminated on health and safety grounds.
Yeah.
And some of those assessments almost sort of reek a bit of, are they being made for the purpose of actually ending contracts, or are they being made for the purpose of actually assessing overlapping duties and those things?
Yep.
And then there's, in some instances, there's real overreach by principals about almost interfering with the way that people work, and that's not what's intended by Section 34.
Yep, that's right. Absolutely. And for me, I just find it really, it's more than frustrating. It's almost inexcusable that health and safety can be used as that battering ram to get potentially other agendas across the line.
It's something to be very aware of if you are actually engaged as an auditor.
Yeah.
And and it also means that if you're an auditor, it's a large site, then the time spent at that site needs to be commensurate with the
Absolutely.
operation of the entity and what goes on at that site.
Yep.
And a flying visit won't cut it.
No way, no. And the other, I mean, the other critical piece is understanding the scope of that visit in terms of what standard are we being assessed against. There's so many factors. It's really auditing 101, and it doesn't seem to be getting done at even the highest levels.
I think because health and safety experts or professionals or whatever are generally not regulated.
No, that's correct.
Same problem that arises with employment advocates, etc. That we've talked about this before, Matt, but I'm of the view that there should be a regulatory body over health and safety professionals, and that they should be subject to discipline if they don't meet the ethical requirements and all of the other main requirements in terms of discharging their duties as an auditor, but also as an advisor.
Yep, and you don't get any arguments from this end. I absolutely agree. It's critical.
And there's got to be some gatekeeping around, you don't necessarily have to have qualifications, but you'd have to prove that you had the requisite expertise to actually be out there giving advice to people about health and safety.
Yep, absolutely. Dee, thank you for raising those points. For me, that really resonates. It strikes home. Just in regards to honouring your valuable time, I'm just looking at the clock and I'm thinking, gosh, I really should let you go. But what I was hoping to ask is whether you would consider coming back, perhaps on a regular basis, so that we can catch up and cover some of these, because really we're just kind of scratching the surface here. There's so many. When I go back to listen to this again, which I invite everyone who's tuned in live to do so, I'm sure I'll be able to tease out lots of areas that we just need to explore further. There's no doubt about it. So if that's okay with you, we'll definitely line that up.
And I think that there needs to be more work done on the overlapping duties stuff, and understanding what having control and what the same or similar duty is. So perhaps we can we could even have a bit of a discussion around that.
Let's do
that. Or get a panel together to actually discuss those things about how they work, because I think that there's a real misunderstanding about that, and some people got overboard and some people undercook it. So
I absolutely agree. My background's predominantly in the construction space, and when it comes to the overlapping duties and how to simplify it without completely overcooking it has been the biggest juggling act of the last decade for me. Really keen to.
The thing about that space, it's actually not that hard to conceptually deal with it, because it's generally a shared workspace.
Yes.
But when one person's off-site and actually does a different functional role, then you've got to look at what you're what you both have to do. And so, like, if it's a landlord and a tenant that's running a business there, what are there? And I think it comes down to making sure that sprinklers and that are maintained and all of those things, and fire risk and that. It's very much around what each of them are both connected with.
All right, that's definitely going to be the topic of the next time we get together. And I love the idea of a panel as well. That gets me thinking about other big, massive projects I'm working on in the background, which I'll be going public in the foreseeable, and I'll certainly be speaking with you, DeAnne, about that as well. So watch this space. But look, for now, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.
Really valuable. I'm sure everyone's getting a lot out of this. I'm really excited about our next catch up already. And I'll be in touch. So look, have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll speak soon.
Great. Thank you. Cheers.
You're very welcome. Okay. Thank you so much. All right, team. Look, thank you everyone for tuning in to the live presentation. It's really awesome to see many of you tuning in on this live session. As I've mentioned before, this is the beginning of the next chapter. So we did this about a year ago, where we did dozens of amazing interviews with several subject matter experts. This is going to become a regular thing between myself and Dee, but I'll also be bringing in some familiar faces, some from New Zealand, some from overseas, and also be introducing you all to some new faces. If you want to check out the previous recordings, jump onto these details below on Spotify. Even if you aren't a subscriber to Spotify, you can still access it. It's all freely available. Jump onto Spotify, do a search for Advanced Safety. You will find all of the recordings. And also, if you do a search on YouTube, if you want to see the video as well as the audio, you can catch us on the Advanced Safety YouTube page as well. Tons of free, just amazing, valuable content for you all basically with the aim of helping to raise that bar. We're bringing each other up, because if we sit around waiting for others to do that for us, we are going to be waiting for a very long time. I've been in this game for 12 years now, and I'm still waiting for the official bodies to assist with that. So let's just do it. Let's get on with it. Let's support one another, and I'll see you back on the Facebook group discussion boards in the near future. All right, take care, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Leave us your thoughts, comments, ideas, topics, people you'd like me to talk to. Feel free to stick that at the bottom of this thread, and I'll pick you up there. Okay, take care, everyone. See you later. Bye now.